chat about things that I remember along the way. Today is Monday, June 13th, 1944 in Rogers City. It's about 2 o'clock in the afternoon. It's kind of rainy today, about 50 degrees, and I'm 82 years old. And now I was born December 15th, 1911, in the Pedal Cow House over here on Michigan Avenue, which most of you kids remember. And the D&M Railroad, I always say that I beat the D&M Railroad by 3 days. I was born the 15th of December, and the first D&M Railroad came into Rogers City. First D&M coach came in. The depot at that time was set up on the corner of Ontario and 2nd Street. So I beat the train by 3 days. They had a big hullabaloo. Of course, I didn't remember too much about it. Michigan Lime had started in 1911, and Dad at that time was working for the Pressfield Bank. At about age, my first recollections are about age 4, I would say. And one of the first things I recall is being on a boat, one of the D&C boats, going to Detroit or Toledo or Cleveland, and to see a doctor about my polio problem. That it hit me when I was about age 2 in the right foot, and also caused a spine curvature. Most of the time, and even in the early years, I used crutches for as long as I can remember. I was told later that the doctors really in those early days didn't know too much about polio, and that scourge, of course, periodically hit the country, and I say thank God for the Salk vaccine that finally came in to hold that in check along about the middle 1950s. Now, I had been hit while visiting with my grandparents, Julius and Teresa Grambua, out in Metz. They were babysitting for my parents, and which, of course, grandparents did. And I spent, of course, a lot of time out there. They took me to the doctors the best that they knew. About the only thing that they ever did was put a cast on the leg and put me on crutches. The rest of the time I just kind of hobbled or walked with or without crutches, trying to walk without crutches most of the time. One of the incidents that I recall in regard to the polio happened in Metz. Probably it was maybe about age 4, I suppose. And Herman and I frequently went out there and stayed with Grandma and Grandpa while the folks went on some trip or excursion or went to Detroit to visit relatives and friends. And that while I was there visiting, a lady came over to visit with great-great-grandmother Patke. Now, she at that time was living with Grandma and Grandpa Grambua. She lived there for some times, and sometimes she went over to visit some of the Lagners or the other relatives. You recall she was a very elderly lady, and and what happened at that time was that a neighbor lady, Mrs. Rearing, I remember her name was, came over to see her just to visit. And now these people talked in German. Of course, Herman and I could understand German very well. We were both very fluent in the early days because the parents spoke German at the house, so they could speak English too. The same was true of my grandparents. But many times they just preferred to talk in German. So this lady was talking in German, and she said to this great-great-grandmother Patke, she says, "What is Mr. Carroll?" In other words, she said, "What's wrong with me, meaning Harry, that he drags that foot around that way?" And that was, of course, I suppose, a sensible question to ask. And Now, great-grandmother Patke just said right offhand, "Where be hexed." In other words, the evil spirits got into them. Now, they frequently in the early days, that's what they said when people couldn't understand what happened to people. It was evil spirits. Now, that wasn't considered to be necessarily anti-religious. It was just that was an expression, I suppose, that came from the old country. Now, and that was all there was to it. Now, the old grandmother Patke, of course, died about 1916. And I remember her very well. She used to read Märchen or fairy tales to Herman and I. She seemed to be quite literate. She not only could read English, but she could read German. Where she had picked up the English, who knows? But I mean, she seemed to be she liked to read. She used to read my grandfather got a daily Detroit paper, which was printed in German, was called the Detroit Abendblatt. In other words, a paper with everything was printed in German. That was very common in the big cities in those days. They had papers were published in the language of the area, or where most of these people came from Europe. And but she was a very, very nice elderly lady and seemed to like kids a lot. And I have a good picture of her that was taken, I think probably about the year that she died, along with Grandma Gramberg and Herman and I, taken in front of the old house out there in Metz. A beautiful picture. Now, one of my first remembrances, of course, is attending kindergarten in the fall of 1917. And the teacher was Mrs. Lillian Dedman, which many of the rest of you kids had. Now, I recall the phonics classes and where we made sounds, and we had simple books to use with the words and pictures like dogs and cats and horses and houses and trees and shoes and caps and dresses and so forth. And I recall that we practiced writing on slate boards with a piece of slate. That was the item that they gave kids to learn how to form letters and form numbers. And you wrote on the slate, and when you wanted to erase it, you just took a little piece of cloth and just erased it. You didn't get it to paper until you could, until you got some proficiency, and of course paper was expensive. And then of course, later on, of course, you were given a pencil to use, the old yellow pencil, which is still used today. There's an interesting story about the yellow pencil, which is a kind of a symbol of American education, and that is the yellow pencil, which is still frequently, of course they make it all colors now, but originally most of them were yellow. And the story is that came out of China. Now, China had invented the pencil many, I don't know how long ago, but probably a century or two before. And the earliest pencils were used by the royal families. And the royal family color was yellow. And so those early pencils, which was lead encased in a wood case, were yellow. And that's where we get the yellow pencil, which is so common in education today. And so, as I say, you practice on the slate your 1, 2, 3s and the ABCs, and later on you went to paper itself. In the kindergarten class, I looked it up afterwards, there were 104 kids that reported. Now, Michigan Line was growing by leaps and bounds at that time, and the number of people that were coming in, of course, were young people, they had families, and so there were 104 kids. Now, what to do with 104? Well, I found out later from H.H. Gilpin that they split those classes into the morning and afternoon sessions, and there were still too many. So some of the kids that seemed to be proficient in their ABCs and 1, 2, 3s, they moved on into the first grade. And others, they were just told to go back home and wait a year, because many of them were very, very immature, and in certain cases, I think the parents just sent the kids to kindergarten and hoped that the school would take them. And so it was finally managed, but the classes were very, very big. And then, of course, I still, right even today, I still recall some of my kindergarten classmates. Now, some of them are still around Rogers City today, who were in that class that's where I started. Now, your names, for example, some of you people will remember these names. There was Beth Monroe. I talked to her the other day on the phone. There was Catherine Kroll Pollock. I talked to her the other day on the phone. There was Lydia Hornbacher-Duer. There was Ann Hilla Paquette. There was Tony Arch. There was Ann Myers Morley. There was Marie Yeager Fleming. The others that were in the class who were passed on, but these are well known, known to many of you brothers and sisters. There's Louis Slominski, Big Louis. Big Louis was my classmate. He was about a foot taller than I was. He was a foot taller than everybody. And there was Louis Levesque. You might even know. There was Rex O'Toole. There was Ralph O'Toole. There was Reuben Bruning, who became the big electrical contractor here. There was Max Kaminsky, one of Morrison's boys. There was Edna Lamb, Bigland. Edna Lamb was my secretary when I was superintendent for many years. There was Melvina Lamb, who was another sister, and there was Laverne Lamb. There was Lorraine Fleming. There was a Hector Beeson. There was a Lois Glacier. Those are just a few of the names. Now, there were other schools in the district other than just here in Rogers. There was a Claybank School up near the State Park, and there was the Horn School over on Wenzel Highway near the County Poor Farm. But those people, of course, they could or could not have, most of them did not have kindergarten. They started in the first grade in the rural areas. But that was all part of this school district at that time. Now, the St. John's Lutheran School had a school that started in 1916, but they didn't have kindergarten. The first teacher they had over there was a Reverend Ross, who was also the minister. Then the following year, they got a regular teacher to handle the class. The St. Ignatius Catholic School didn't start until about 1922, so all of those kids, for the first several years, we were all together. In 1918, there was a four-room addition put on the old wood building, which you will remember, you attended also. And it was changed from 4 to 8 rooms. And at that time, they put in a basement, and they put in inside flush toilets. Before that, when I went there, or the rest of the people went there, the toilets were outside. And also, of course, in 1912 and 13, they had built the red brick for high school purposes. That was the building that you and I attended to. And now our dad, George W., was on the Board of Education during this period of time when they put the addition on the elementary building and also built the middle school building, or what we call the old high school. And he was also on the board, of course, in 1927-28, when they built the high school that you and I attended. Now, just for the record, I remember most of the teachers that I had in K-12. In kindergarten, as I say, I had Lillian Dedman. In the first grade, I had a Margaret Moore. She married a Buckets Kuhlman. And in the second grade, I had a Wilhelmina Cars. In the third grade, I had Fiend Campbell. She later became Miss John D. Sibley, Mrs. John D. Sibley. Then in the fourth grade, I had a Doris Giroux. And in the fifth grade, I had Dora Brady. In the sixth grade, I had Dora Brady. Dora Zanella. She came here as a young girl, an Italian girl out of the UP, and then she married Vince Brady. And in the 12th grade, in the old building, there was H.H. Gilpin, there was Milton Young was the principal, and his wife Lucille was the English teacher. There was John D. Sibley, who taught the math. There was Gertrude Fiegel, who taught the social studies. There was Bertha Klein, who taught the Latin and English. There was Beatrice Comlicoy, she taught the bookkeeping and shorthand and typing and business arithmetic. There was Josie Schutz, who later became Josie Valentine. And then there also was Genevieve McLouth Raines. She was a general substitute, but she was primarily a Latin teacher originally. And now some just might mention this in passing, that during World War I in 1917-18, Genevieve McLouth, or Genevieve Raines, was also the high school principal for a period of a year. Now in 27 and in 28, we moved into the new high school building in the spring of 28. just in time for graduation. Brother Herman was a member of that class of 28 that moved in there. We moved in there about April, and they graduated in June. Now that following fall, in the fall of 28, of course, they expanded the curriculum because they had some room. And at that time, Mr. Hoffer came in to teach industrial arts. Then Paul Thornley came in, and he also taught chemistry and physics. And then there was Catherine Davies Gooden. There was Charlotte English came in, or she taught in the English department. There was Ruth Adams Hamilton. There was Winifred Clark, who taught history and Latin. And there was Martha Klinsman. She taught math, and German, French. There was Isabel Craig. She taught social studies. There was Hurdle Feeman. Hurdle Feeman was the first phys ed teacher that we had. And there was John Strandberg. He taught chemistry and physics. There was Mildred Lendorf. She taught English department. There was Paul Livingston. He also taught in the phys ed department after Hurdle Feeman. And there was Frida Olson. She taught in the commerce department. Those were the teachers that were in the high school area during the time that I was in high school. Some of those people, of course, stayed over, and you probably had some of them. Now to get into some of the other events along the way, I'll say it that way. I remember November 1917, when World War I ended. And I remember people gathered in town late that afternoon after the word came through, down at the courthouse square, and they danced in the streets down there. And I remember the band played. The band played out of the old gazebo. That gazebo, of course, stood on the courthouse lawn there for long years, and now it's down in the center of Westminster Park. It's still the same gazebo. Then other things that occurred in September 1919, I recall going to St. Louis, Missouri, to go to the McLean Orthopedic Sanitarium for treatment on my leg. And my grandfather Dramberg came along and stayed with me down there in St. Louis until June of 1920. And I recall living in a rooming house right across from the hospital. That was a big, big hospital. I have a beautiful book of that whole hospital, still have it today. And it was for orthopedic treatment. There was a big gym there where there was a lot of stretching racks treatment, and there was whirlpools, and there was heat, and there was water treatment. And there was all types of orthopedic devices there for straightening out my spine, which they did. They did a beautiful job straightening out my spine. But they didn't do too much for my leg as such, except keep it in a cast, keep out a brace, and keep exercising. Well, the worst thing that could have happened, of course, was leave the darn braces on, or leave the casts on. But anyway, they did. But I recall most of the treatment that I had came in the morning. And so in the afternoon, we had a lot of times to roam around. Of course, Grandpa loved to roam around in St. Louis, Missouri. We'd catch a streetcar, go downtown, or go to some other section of the city and just get out and walk. He just liked to see things. And sometimes I know that we went out as far as the city limits, and then we'd walk back in. And we spent a lot of time at Forest Park and at the Shaw Gardens. He loved to go down to the banks of the Mississippi River and walk. And quite often on those walks, we would stop in and have a little lunch at some restaurant. And usually I had a bottle of Red Pop or something like that. And Grandpa Dramberg would have a glass of beer along with a little bowl of soup or something. Now you remember this was 1919 and Prohibition it came in, but it didn't take effect until about January of 1920, so beer was still available. And and then I recall another incident that occurred down in St. Louis, Missouri. We took an excursion boat one day. Well, not just us. I mean, there were a lot of people there. One of those river boats with a paddle wheel. And we went downstream probably, maybe 30, 40 miles, I would say, something like that. There were a lot of people on there. They had picnic lunches and baskets that they had with them, and they were eating there along the way. Then they would stop here and stop there. People got on, people got off. I would say we went down probably about 40 miles. And then we got off. And there was a taxi waiting for us there. There was a wagon taxi, a horse-drawn wagon. And I don't know how many people got off, maybe 15 or 20 or something like that. Anyway, we got on these wagons, and they took us inland maybe about 4 or 5 miles. And there we connected up with a train, passenger train, that was going back up into St. Louis. So we got this, is of course all prearranged. This was an excursion. I forgot what it cost, several dollars, I suppose. And then in a matter of an hour or two, or whatever it was, that we got back into St. Louis. So, and then there were other people down there that we knew a few people. There were some relatives of the Koopman family down there called the Coopers, and we went and visited them periodically because we were there over Christmas. I remember that was the first Christmas that I was ever away from home, and it was a little bit different. We had a little hunk of a piece of balsam or something like that people had made available to us, and we put on a few little balls and stuff that had been sent. And but it was quite an experience. Going back and forth, we went now. We stayed there that first time probably about 9 months. I had 2 minor operations, but nothing significant. Still on crutches, still on a full leg brace. And then a year we went back home, and then a year later or so went back for another check and stayed about 2 months. And they wanted to note the progress that had been made and things of that type. And so Grandpa went with me again. Now, interesting to note that when we went down to Detroit, I know once when we went by boat, another time we went by train, that we stayed with the Zimmermans, with Marie Zimmerman. That's Grandfather Gramberg's sister. He was the brewmaster at the Voigt Brewery at that time, and the first time, and but they lived right adjacent to the brewery itself. Now, we went down in 19, of course, the brewery was still going. But when we went back again a year and a half later, of course, they still lived there, but the brewery was closed, or they were in the process of selling everything out. And but they did also have a home on Grosse Ile. And then on one occasion, the second time that we went down, we went to Grosse Ile and then this was at night, and on the way back from St. Louis, Missouri, and we took a streetcar out as far as I went, near Trenton, called Riverview, got off at the Grosse Ile toll bridge, paid the toll, walked inland, I forget how far, and finally got to the Zimmerman home on the island. He knew, Grandfather Gramberg knew exactly where he was going because he'd been there a good number of times. But now I was going to say the train that we took going back and forth to St. Louis was the Wabash Cannonball. I went down through portions of Indiana, Illinois, along the branches of the Wabash River, and we crossed into St. Louis on Eads Bridge. That bridge is still there today. It's one of the first big bridges across the Mississippi River. But I remember even as a young kid being impressed with the Mississippi River. It's hard that you see in front of you is actually moving at a pretty good clip with the current. It's so big that you lose that perspective of it. It looks just like it is a lake. I don't know how far it is at that mile, maybe a half mile wide or whatever it happened to be. It was a tremendous volume of water that was on the march. As you can imagine what that looks like when it's in flood. And I know that there was a certain amount of flood in the spring of 20 when we were there. We went down to see it. And it was kind of scary. You see parts of barns going right down the middle of the river with chickens sitting on the top. They probably could not find a way off. And now, after I came back from St. Louis, of course, went back into school, and then in the 1925, fall of 1925, arrangements were made so that I would go to the newly opened Shriners Hospital for Crippled Children in Minneapolis. And so Dad took me up there, went across the straits, and went into Minneapolis, and he took me to the hospital there, and they admitted me, entered me, and then Dad went home. And while I was there, I had 4 major operations on the leg and on the foot. And plus I had another operation to remove the tonsils and adenoids. Now it was while I was there that Uncle Ed Olson and Aunt Louise, they were living in Minneapolis, and really they were only about 4 miles away. Ed was in his final year of dental school, and they were living in an apartment which was immediately adjacent to the University of Minnesota Stadium. And I mean adjacent, only about 50 feet away was the wall of the stadium, and on Walnut Street, I remember. Dorothy May was a very young girl, about 2. Last time I told her, she said she just didn't remember. She just kind of remembered that I was there, but didn't know any of the particulars about it at all. But they used to come and get me. The Ed had an old Model T Ford. They would stop at the hospital. Made arrangements had been made, and they would pick me up, say, on a Friday afternoon, and I would stay with them until Sunday afternoon. And in the meantime, then we'd go for rides out in the country and see various lakes and entertainment spots. Now, also at that same time, Aunt Bertha was a nurse at the Snelling Veterans Hospital in St. Paul. And we would go and see her, and then she would come over for a meal. And but they had, in the early days, they had both served at Fort Snelling. Now it's interesting to note that both Uncle Ed and Aunt Louise are buried at the military cemetery at Fort Snelling up there in Minneapolis, St. Paul. Now the second time I went, I stayed up there until the following spring, I think it was. Yes, I went there in the fall, and I stayed through Christmas, and then the spring I came home. Now the biggest thing about coming home for me was that I wasn't on crutches. It straightened the leg to the point where I could wear regular shoes, and I could walk. I didn't walk with too much clarity yet because I hadn't had too much practice, but I did come back and started to walk without the use of crutches. And then I went back in probably about a year later. I think when I was in the 9th grade sometime, spring of the year of the 9th grade or something like that, I went back alone. They wanted a checkup for their records. And so I went back. Dad took me up to Mackinac City, and I got on the train, went across on the Chief Wadham, and went up to Trout Lake, caught the Sioux Line, and into Minneapolis. They had made arrangements with a taxi or a limousine or a friend of the hospital to meet me, and they were right there. And they took me over to the hospital, I recall. I can't remember, it was in the morning. And they started right in after I got to the hospital. There was a whole contingent of fellas there. They were mostly these young guys out of the University of Minnesota. And they went over right and left. They took pictures. They took x-rays. And we're looking at the records. And that was it. After a period of maybe about 3 or 4 hours, that evening again, I was on the train. No, you're right. I stayed there overnight. I stayed at the hospital overnight. And then the next morning, they put me on the train, or later in the afternoon, I guess it was. And then they ran overnight and came across, and Dad met me at Mackinac City. And that was the last work that I'd done on my leg. Oh, I had subsequent braces made over the years, and but no more operations. I think that there were a total of 6 altogether that I had on the leg at that time. Now, the big thing was then, of course, that in the fall of 26, I started the high school. I took the usual academic program that was available here over a period of 4 years. I took the 4 years of English, and I took 3.5 years of math, 4 years of social studies, which included a year of ancient history, a year of modern history, year of U.S. history and a half semester in economics and civics. I took a couple years of Latin, and I took a year of typing. And then from then on, now, during the summers that I was in high school, I had several jobs that we worked on. I think it was in the summer of, oh boy, I can't think. I think it was the summer of 27. I worked as a part of a crew that ran the survey line from Spence Road to the Akiak River along the bluff. That later became US 23, which it is today. But we ran the blaze line for the road that was to follow there in the years succeeding. That road finally went through in 35 when they completed the road between Roger City and Onaway, the Roger City and Alpena, and then continued on, built the bridges across the Trout River, built a new bridge across the Akiak River, and it was in probably 36 or 37 that the road going right from Roger City to Sheboygan was finally completed. Before that, you know, if you wanted to go to Sheboygan, you had to go by way of Onaway. So that was quite an improvement. Now, in the summers of 28 and 29, I worked at Michigan Limestone. We worked down there with a crew of kids out of high school. Anybody, you had to be 16. I think there were a few that sneaked in at 15, I think. But they had a crew that did a lot of the general yard work, a lot of the cleanup work, building of roads, building of the part of the breakwater, a lot of cement pouring, a lot of working with cement products, unloading cement cars. And it was a wonderful experience. I remember the first year, 1928, they paid us 25 cents an hour. The next summer, they paid us 27 and a half. You might say, gee, how cheap. But that wasn't bad in those days because there were a lot of men who were married men. They were making 35, 38, 40 cents an hour down there. And they were married, had a family. But you could do quite a bit with 25 cents in those days. And you worked 8 hours, sometimes 9, sometimes 10. Well, if you worked 8 hours, that was $2. Well, that wasn't bad if eggs were about 6 or 7 cents a dozen. You can see that you might swing it. You could buy a pair of shoes for $5, so after a couple of days of work, you could buy yourself a pair of shoes. Well, anyway, then in the summer of 30, when I was scheduled to go on to college, I worked at the bank. I worked right here at the Prescott Bank with Dad. I worked on a check posting machine, and interesting to know who were some of the people at the bank at that time. Well, there was Dad, there was a man named C.R. Carter, there was Laureen Delgin, who later became Mrs. John Blasky. John was there. There was Elmer Beatty, there was Dorothy Buda, and there was Alex Konechny. Now, I don't know, the only one that I think of other than myself that are left there right now is Laureen Delgin. Laureen Delgin Blasky. Laureen Blasky. I saw her the other day. Now, I graduated in June of 1930, and then was scheduled to go on to Michigan State. Now, our dad was Secretary of the Board of Education. And so the diploma that I have, and probably you have too, mine is signed by G.W. Grambua, Secretary of the Board of Education, and Rudolph Delgin, President of the Board, H.H. Gilpin, Superintendent, and John D. Sibley as the principal. Now, in my class at that time, there were 25. We graduated a class of 25. Now, it's interesting to note that even today, right now as I talk, there's still 13 of my class left. And I think that that's pretty good. The good Lord has been very, very kind. Here are those that are left. There's Lena Lamb Jimenez. She lives in Nashville, Tennessee. She'd be a sister to Mildred Mertz, Mildred Lamb. There's Ida Bell Brooks McVeigh. That was a well-known family here, the Brooks family. There's Artis Hopp, Herman Hopp's daughter. There's Beatrice Gordon Urson. The Gordon family is well known. Remember Charlie's sister. There's Mildred Campbell Henshaw. Her dad was employed at Michigan Lime at that time. There's Cecilia Cook Scott. The Cook family around here. There was Bill and Charlie and Wesley and George and several other boys. Then there was Marjorie McAllister. There was Helen Hawkins, Tom Hawkins' sister. There was Ora Hamilton. She's still living in Detroit. There's Alfred Kalida. He lives at Houghton Lake. Otis Pollock lives here, right here in Rogers City. He's married to Catherine Kroll. And there's Harry Grambua. Now, there are others in my class that have passed on, but you'll know names a lot of these. There's Melvin Wenzel. There was Mary Duretsky. There was Marjorie Ellis. She was from Hillsburg. There was Mary Party, Booza. Edna Lamb Vigeland. Edna Lamb, as I say, was my secretary when I was superintendent. There's Irma Macklin Scott. There was Grace Vogler Green. Lois Ross Curvin. Lois Ross, that's Reverend Ross's daughter. Reuben Bruning. Reuben Bruning was a very successful electrical contractor in Detroit and ended up here in Rogers City. He still has a daughter that runs the Northern Electric here. And then there's Dora Hamilton Calder. And there's Ralph O'Toole and Rex O'Toole. Ralph died about a year ago. So those are the 25 that were in that group. Now in the fall of 1930, I went to Michigan State along with Herman, my brother Herman. Herman had originally started at Michigan. He had transferred to Michigan State after his sophomore year, I believe it was, yeah. And because he had decided he was going to go into landscape architecture, and they had because of an agricultural relationship, they had a very outstanding landscape architecture school at Michigan State. And so he came over there, and for a year, and we roomed together. He stayed for a year until the fall of '31, and then at the end of that first year, he went back to the University of Michigan. And then I moved in. I joined the Sigma Alpha Epsilon fraternity, SAE, and I moved into the fraternity house and spent the rest of my college life there living in the fraternity house at Michigan State. Now, at Michigan State at that time had about 3,000 students. The University of Michigan had about 7,500. And when I went to the University of Michigan, after completing my bachelor's degree, I took my master's degrees at U of M. And I remember when I went to Michigan, University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, I said, boy, this is big. I was back to Michigan State just a few days ago. Michigan State now has an enrollment of 44,000. The University of Michigan has about 40,000. That shakes you up, I'm telling you, when you see that campus today from the days that I was there. Well, things went along in college, moving right along. And then all of a sudden the Great Depression this was in the Depression years, of course. In March 6th, I remember, of '33, the banks closed. All the nation's banks were closed by order of the federal government. Well, Dad got a hold of me in one way or another, and he said, you'll have to come home. He said, there's no money. I had a check that he had sent me to cover my room and board for a month, and he couldn't cash it. Nobody would take a check. Cash was the only thing that counted. So I remember he sent me $5 and said, well, get home the best you can. So I dropped out of school. It was at the end of a term. I waited till the end of the term. I put all my belongings into I had my dad's trunk. I put all my belongings in the trunk that I couldn't carry home, took a couple small suitcases, and left the trunk there in the attic of the fraternity house. and with hopes that maybe I'll get it someday. And I proceeded to bum a ride home. And so I stayed home for the rest of that spring term, summer, and then by fall they started to release a little of the money that had been tied up, because it didn't make any difference where you had your money in the bank. It was tied. You couldn't take money out of savings even though the savings was sitting there. If you had money in the checking account, you couldn't take it out because nobody would cash a check. But by fall, by the time fall rolled around, there were gradually putting in some safeguards so that some of the money, at least, I forget just how much, was released. And Dad said, well, we want you to go back for your last year, get it out of the way. I did have to go later on, and I'll explain that, to make up that one term. But nevertheless, by the following fall then of 33, I did go back and complete the rest of my work to get my degree and also to get my teaching certificate. That summer that I came home, or that spring I came home, I found a few little jobs. I worked for the highway department, shoveling clay, 25 cents an hour, earned a few dollars, and I think I had about $30, and I decided that I wanted to go to the World's Fair in Chicago. That was going on at that time, the Great World's Fair. Sally Rand and all the other great entertainment that was available. And so Dad said, it's all right with him. And I said, well, I'll tell you, I've got a friend that I've been corresponding with, a fellow named Murphy, who lived just outside of the outskirts of Chicago on a farm, a truck farm. And he said that if I came down, they could stay with them, no cost. They'd even, if they wanted to work, they'd even pay me a few dollars a day to help work on the farm. But there was there'd be no cost for room and board. And then on weekends, we would go to the fair, because he had been there several times, but he'd always go on a weekend because he had work to do with his parents' farm. And so, okay, I bummed a ride, got as far as East Lansing. I was going to go over to the Turley House, but the Turley House was closed. Nobody was going to summer school, so the place was closed. But I can understand that, because not too many people had any money to go any place. So I ran into a professor by the name of Mason and told him what my predicament was. Well, he said, come on over and stay with me. He had a 2-bedroom apartment, and he wasn't married, and so I did. And it just so happened that I woke up probably about 4 o'clock in the morning, and oh man, I had a stomach ache that could almost draw my knees right up to my chin. So I called to him, and he came in and he said, "What?" I said, "Boy," I said, "something wrong." Well, he said, "We're going to get you to a doctor right away." So he called ahead to Sparrow Hospital. This was probably about 5 o'clock in the morning then, or something like that. And it happened that the doctor that he wanted was going to be there within a half hour. And so the attendant there said, "Well, come right ahead. You come right into the emergency room, and when the doctor gets there, he'll take a look at you." And so he loaded me into his car, and we went down Michigan Avenue to the Sparrow Hospital, got into the emergency area, and sure enough, within a few minutes, in comes the doctor. I remember Limon Snyder. And he poked around with him. He said, "Oh," he said, that's appendix." He said, "That's got to come out of there." What to do? Wow. Well, I said to Mason, I said, "You call my dad." I knew what the number was. And I said, I'll see that it's paid. And explained the situation to him. And so he did. He got a hold of Dad. And Dad said, "Well, go ahead." He said, "The hospital just have to take my word that I'll pay the bill." And well, which was enough. So they operated, I think about 7 o'clock in the morning. I had the operation for appendectomy. Well, I stayed in the hospital for a few days. Gee, I have a copy of that bill. Brother George, I know, has a copy of that bill. It was ridiculous, like $2 a day for board, and the room was, oh my, it like $8 a day, I think it was, something like that. Anyway, it was a very minor bill. The operation, $100 for the doctor. Special nurse, I think it was $8 a day. And anyway, I stayed at the hospital for about 4 or 5 days. Then he excused me and told me, and then Mason said, well, you